When historians recount the French Revolution of 1792, their attention usually lingers on what happened in the streets, the September massacres, the fall of the monarchy, and the revolutionary fervour that consumed Paris. Yet the true story, largely absent from revolutionary records and still hidden in archival margins, unfolded in the towers. It commenced with a straightforward confiscation order. Workers throughout France received instructions to remove bells from churches, cathedrals, and civic towers across the nation for metal reclamation to support the war effort. While the Republic readied itself to defend against monarchist forces, the objective was utilitarian: confiscate the bronze, melt it down, and assess whether the material could supply the revolution's desperate need for cannons and currency. But the instant workers started removing the bells from Notre Dame and other ancient structures, something unforeseen occurred. They discovered mechanisms that had remained concealed for centuries. Inside the tower chambers, at heights that few maintenance records ever documented, the teams found acoustic systems and resonance apparatus that matched no recognized bell-hanging method. Their configuration was peculiar, their complexity was remarkable, and the engineering bore no resemblance to anything in contemporary bell-founding manuals. It didn't even echo French or Italian campanology as typically understood. This never appeared in official revolutionary proclamations. It failed to reach the newspapers documenting the Republic's triumphs. Yet in that year's internal documentation, a specific phrase emerges repeatedly: unanticipated mechanisms, excessive complexity, purpose unclear. The authorized account would eventually reduce all of this to traditional bell supports, abandoned clock mechanisms, or merely decorative architectural features. Nothing remarkable, nothing deserving attention. But the removal records from that period, the ones processed in shadowy government facilities while Paris celebrated its liberation from monarchy, reveal something else. They reveal workers positioned next to copper conduits fabricated with accuracy far superior to any metalwork of that era could produce. Components assembled so seamlessly that even through the grainy quality of revolutionary-era sketches, their sophistication is undeniable. Patterns of coiled metal and geometric chambers that bear no similarity to any documented European bell-hanging tradition, but something more ancient, more mathematical, more intentional. And the further they dismantled, the more the systems ceased resembling campanology as we understand it, and increasingly resembled technology that had been utilized, maintained, and purposefully concealed. Initially, the removal crews attempted to classify everything in the most straightforward manner: elaborate bell supports, forgotten tower machinery, decorative metalwork from earlier renovations. But as documentation grew and additional systems were revealed in towers across Paris, the contradictions expanded. Why were certain acoustic chambers engineered with dimensions that created perfect harmonic resonance at specific frequencies? Why were particular copper coils arranged in geometric patterns as though designed for energy distribution rather than sound production? Why did certain conduits continue into the tower walls well beyond the boundaries of any bell installation? And the matter that disturbed even the most conventional metalworkers: why were these systems so enormous? The bell removal demanded accurate inventories, yet the acoustic infrastructure within sections of Notre Dame, Sainte-Chapelle, and dozens of parish churches seemed constructed for something vastly different than calling the faithful to prayer. Removal crews privately acknowledged amongst themselves that the scale and sophistication didn't correspond with any architectural or bell-founding documentation. And while none of them employed terminology like vanished technologies, they were recognizing something equally disturbing. Someone had constructed these systems previously. Not bells, not musical instruments, power generation. As the records multiplied, so did the quiet. Reports grew briefer, accounts became ambiguous, sketches ceased displaying the broadest perspectives of the mechanisms. And then the tower chambers were partially sealed again in late 1792, the remaining infrastructure secured where necessary for structural stability, and much of what had been revealed was stripped of its components and melted down. Only pieces survive: documentation, several technical drawings, and the subdued accounts of archivists who examined the files before some vanished. But even from what endures, a configuration becomes apparent. Systems too sophisticated for any documented bell installation. Engineering too exact for the accepted chronology. Construction techniques that appear inherited, infrastructure that seems to originate from an entirely different technological epoch. When the removal crews ascended past the initial accessible chambers within Paris's towers, the assumptions were straightforward. They anticipated discovering standard bell-hanging apparatus, possibly some abandoned clock machinery, and dispersed traces from earlier renovations. Nothing peculiar, nothing exceptional. But within weeks that premise disintegrated because rather than a clear arrangement of bells and supports, the crews encountered a succession of acoustic chambers that didn't function the way tower spaces of an ordinary cathedral are meant to function. The initial anomaly was tuning. Each tower, Notre Dame, Saint-Sulpice, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and dozens more, appeared to maintain the same fundamental resonance frequency, the same harmonic intervals, the same geometric arrangement. Different churches, different builders, different centuries shouldn't exhibit that. Different architects, different bell founders, different hundreds of years. They don't construct in flawless acoustic alignment with structures built generations apart. Yet throughout Paris they did. Resonance chambers from one cathedral positioned to amplify frequencies that corresponded perfectly with chambers in another church kilometers away. Acoustic channels aligned with channels in completely different districts. Bell chambers maintained the same dimensional ratios even when constructed in vastly different architectural styles. It was as though every tower that ever rose above Paris was replicating an original frequency pattern, one that no longer appears in any architectural documentation. As the labourers investigated higher, the chambers grew more peculiar. Above the anticipated bell platforms and supporting beams, they started finding metalwork that resembled nothing like bell-hanging apparatus. Substantially more complex coils, considerably tighter geometric arrangements, configurations that appeared too mathematically precise for anything in Europe's recorded campanology. Certain chambers looked nearly excessive, copper-lined spaces with perfect acoustic reflection, executed with an accuracy that didn't correspond to the primitive metalworking of any documented period. And then arrived the finding that confused even the most traditional members of the removal teams: crystalline deposits, mineral formations coating the metal surfaces, substances that had crystallized in patterns that only develop under sustained vibrational exposure at specific frequencies. Yet there exists no historical documentation of these towers producing anything beyond standard bell tones, no records indicating continuous acoustic operation at the intensity necessary to create such formations. Nothing that accounts for why substantial portions of the tower chambers appear as though they have been subjected to sustained harmonic resonance for centuries, potentially millennia. Removal sketches created in 1792 demonstrate this unmistakably. Labourers positioned beside coiled mechanisms so intricate that the men appear primitive by comparison. Copperwork fabricated so accurately that even contemporary electrical engineers examine the archival drawings in amazement. Geometric arrangements and acoustic chambers that mirror technological installations far more sophisticated than anything revolutionary France is attributed with. But the most troubling detail was not what surfaced in the documentation, it was what failed to surface in the archives. The authorized reports composed in the years following the confiscation scarcely reference these characteristics. Certain illustrations exclude the most complex chambers altogether. Particular systems are condensed with indefinite terminology like decorative features or architectural embellishments, even though the sketches demonstrate they were far more intricate than that. The quiet is difficult to overlook. Because if these tower systems genuinely belong to recognized bell-founding traditions, why weren't they portrayed in detail? Why weren't the exceptional acoustic mechanisms recorded thoroughly? Why were the technical drawings dispersed across revolutionary archives instead of compiled into a single metallurgical assessment? Even certain copper components presented a concern. Geometric patterns too precise, surfaces too refined, crystalline deposits too consistent, formations that appeared less like natural corrosion and more like the byproduct of sustained energy transmission. Transmission that, based on the conventional chronology, didn't exist when those towers were presumably constructed. What the removal crews revealed were systems that didn't correspond to French bell founding, didn't correspond to Italian campanology, and didn't even correspond to one another in traditional terms. Instead, they constituted a peculiar technological vocabulary, one that appeared to originate from multiple periods, yet somehow remained cohesive, harmonically aligned, and impossibly exact. The initial surprise arrived with the chambers themselves. These weren't simple bell platforms or basic acoustic spaces. They were geometrically flawless chambers, rooms shaped with precise harmonic proportions, copper-lined surfaces that preserved their reflective quality impeccably across centuries, and acoustic systems arranged with coherence, almost like the remnants of a master frequency network that no longer exists in any repository. Certain chambers were sealed entirely, packed with material so compact that labourers assumed they had reached solid stone. But once breached, they disclosed interiors that appeared undisturbed since the moment they were closed. Polished copper surfaces, geometric coil arrangements, and acoustic configurations that generated more mysteries than solutions. And then arrived the characteristic that still confounds researchers presently: the massive spherical metal housings. Formerly, they were subsequently identified as bell casings, or decorative architectural features. But nothing about them corresponds to characteristic bell design or ornamental metalwork. These were too perfectly spherical, too precisely dimensioned, and too flawlessly balanced, as though they were fabricated with implements capable of sustaining perfect geometry. Certain resonators were broad enough to contain a full-sized bell within their hollow interiors. Others were solid metal with internal cavity structures, almost like the housing for harmonic oscillators or frequency amplification devices. Labourers from 1792 characterized them in personal correspondence as manufactured spheres. Not bells, but geometric forms with an acoustic function, though nobody could specify what that function could have been. Another peculiarity emerged in the arrangement of certain copper systems. These were not merely supporting the bells from above. Many were configured in spiral patterns that made no architectural logic, descending through the tower walls, interconnected between chambers, or positioned around the spherical resonators in geometric arrays. It generated an unsettling possibility. The bells above may not merely serve to call the faithful. They may have served as the visible components of something substantially larger, a system whose true dimensions were never documented, never taught, and never clarified in the authorized history of European architecture. The further the labourers investigated, the more peculiar the discoveries became. Copper components emerged with completely uniform dimensions. Certain surfaces were polished to mirror finishes, refined, almost reflective. Others displayed precision-formed geometric patterns so exact that contemporary metallurgists still debate about what implements could have created them. But the finding that produced the most bewilderment was the crystalline structures embedded within the copper itself. Certain formations appeared, resonant, vibrational, or frequency aligned, yet they were located in systems presumably more ancient than any acoustic science sophisticated enough to generate such results. The authorized explanation provided subsequently: natural mineral deposits, corrosion patterns. But that does not account for why the crystals emerge within the copper in patterns, not randomly distributed, but aligned, geometric, organized as though the metal was exposed to specific frequencies over sustained periods. That variety of result demands vibrational exposure far exceeding bell ringing far exceeding any musical performance and far exceeding anything documented in European architectural history. Shortly following these findings, something peculiar started occurring. Chambers were stripped of their mechanisms, systems were dismantled, complex portions of the installations were removed from the towers entirely. Certain of this was formally designated as metal reclamation, necessary to support the Revolutionary War effort. But the choices about which systems to remove first and which components to melt down immediately generated subdued questions among witnesses, because the mechanisms that were destroyed promptly were invariably the ones that contested the authorized chronology the most. The geometric resonators, the copper coil arrays, the crystalline coated systems, the acoustic chambers that appeared to connect to conduits extending throughout the tower structures. These conduits were possibly the most enigmatic discovery of all. They weren't haphazard architectural features. They were components of a systematic configuration, a network of channels that appeared less like construction details and more like infrastructure. Aligned, calculated, organized as though they once linked to a substantially larger harmonic network, one that connected every major tower throughout Paris and perhaps beyond, long before any culture we recognize ever documented such systems. And yet, almost as quickly as they were revealed, many were destroyed, their components melted down, their purpose unexplored, their presence quietly eliminated from later architectural surveys. When you examine the concluding months of the 1792 bell confiscations, something becomes impossible to disregard. The operation didn't conclude naturally, it was accelerated, not completed, not finished, accelerated. The further the removal crews proceeded, the more the character of their documentation transformed. Initial entries were procedural, almost routine. But by the conclusion, the language becomes guarded, indefinite, and oddly incomplete, as though someone else abruptly controlled what could be recorded. And this is where the ultimate mystery commences, because the final chambers they accessed within Paris's highest towers weren't typical, they weren't architectural, they weren't decorative, they weren't even classifiable as bell-hanging apparatus. They were something else altogether. Multiple accounts, the few that persisted, portrayed systems that abruptly transformed from the recognizable to the inexplicable. Copperwork with connections so precise you couldn't insert a blade between them. Geometric chambers formed with accuracy that pre-industrial France was never meant to possess. Resonators engineered for frequencies far beyond anything produced by bells, and conduits that extended throughout the tower structures, vanishing into the walls beneath contemporary structures. But here's the aspect that always gets concealed. The most sophisticated systems were the ones that were melted down first. Labourers described dismantling complete chambers, removing components, destroying installations that had just been discovered. It wasn't gradual, it was prompt. The authorized explanation: metal shortage, military necessity, revolutionary urgency. But if it was solely about bronze reclamation, why were the most complex, most geometrically precise, most acoustically sophisticated systems the ones destroyed first? And why were simple bells often left hanging while elaborate mechanisms were prioritized for destruction? It doesn't make logic unless those tower systems posed a different variety of danger, not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure within Paris's towers genuinely displayed acoustic engineering beyond pre-revolutionary capacity, and if certain of those systems didn't correspond to any documented bell-founding tradition at all, then the complete accepted narrative of European technological development starts to crumble. Imagine what it would signify if Europe's grandest cathedrals were constructed around something far more ancient, something functional, something engineered, something we didn't build for worship. Imagine what it signifies if the towers weren't merely architectural achievements, but the visible components of a continental frequency network that predates recorded history. And perhaps that is why the 1792 discoveries were systematically destroyed, not to supply the revolution but to eliminate the evidence. The remaining sketches convey their own narrative. Labourers positioned next to systems that appear almost technological. Geometric arrangements that mirror frequency generation, acoustic chambers too sophisticated for their presumed era. These aren't the varieties of findings historians prefer to clarify. They're the varieties they prefer not to discuss at all. And that brings us to the ultimate question. Why was the most sophisticated evidence, the most complex acoustic systems, the most geometrically precise infrastructure destroyed so thoroughly? Because when you step back, the configuration becomes apparent. The resonance chambers were dismantled, the geometric copper arrays were dismantled, the spherical resonators were dismantled, the frequency-aligned conduits were dismantled, the crystalline-coated systems were dismantled, and even portions of the technical documentation vanished, almost as though the confiscation had inadvertently disclosed a chapter of history that wasn't meant to emerge. A chapter more ancient than the French monarchy, more ancient than recorded Christianity, more ancient than the narrative we were provided. And for one brief instant in 1792, the towers opened sufficiently to reveal it, but rather than examining it, they destroyed it, melted it, dismantled it, forgot it, or feigned to. Because if Europe's great cathedrals concealed frequency generation systems erected by a civilization we no longer recognize, then the genuine question is not what was discovered in 1792. It's what else remains within the towers of the world. What other churches, what other structures, what other acoustic systems were quietly destroyed long before anyone thought to document them properly? The 1792 bell confiscation wasn't merely a revolutionary metal reclamation effort. It was a glimpse, a brief inadvertent glimpse into a version of history we were never intended to witness. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.